Imagine waking up in a place where the water glows turquoise, palm trees sway in warm Caribbean winds, and cruise ships glide into harbor like floating cities of luxury. It looks like paradise. It feels like paradise. But beneath the postcard beauty of the U.S. Virgin Islands lies a past filled with conquest, rebellion, slavery, resistance, and global power struggles. This is not just a tropical getaway. This is a crossroads of empires, a battleground of freedom, a paradise with a rebel past. The U.S. Virgin Islands, made up primarily of St. Thomas, St. Croix, and St. John, sit strategically in the Caribbean Sea, east of Puerto Rico. Today, they are an unincorporated territory of the United States. But long before American passports and cruise tourism, these islands were home to indigenous peoples who built thriving societies connected to the wider Caribbean world. The earliest known inhabitants were the Siboney people, followed by the Arawaks, also known as the Taíno. They farmed cassava, fished the abundant waters, and built villages near the coastlines. Their culture was deeply spiritual, tied to nature and community. But by the time Christopher Columbus arrived in 1493, during his second voyage to the Americas, the region had already become contested ground between indigenous groups like the Taíno and the more warlike Caribs. Columbus named the islands Las 11,000 Vírgenes, honoring Saint Ursula and the 11,000 virgins of Christian legend. That name would eventually be shortened to the Virgin Islands. But Columbus did not establish permanent settlements here. Instead, Spain focused its colonial efforts elsewhere in the Caribbean and Central America. Still, European diseases and slave raids devastated the indigenous population. Within decades, the original inhabitants of the islands had nearly vanished. By the 1600s, European powers were locked in fierce competition for Caribbean dominance. Sugar had become white gold, and whoever controlled the islands could control trade routes between Europe, Africa, and the Americas. The Virgin Islands became pieces on a global chessboard. The Dutch and English briefly settled parts of the islands, but it was Denmark that would ultimately shape their destiny. In 1672, the Danish West India Company established a permanent settlement on St. Thomas. Soon after, Denmark took control of St. John in 1718 and purchased St. Croix from France in 1733. Together, these islands became known as the Danish West Indies. The Danish quickly built a plantation economy centered on sugar production. Sugar plantations spread across St. Croix and St. John. To fuel this booming industry, enslaved Africans were forcibly transported across the Atlantic in brutal conditions. By the mid-1700s, enslaved Africans vastly outnumbered European settlers on the islands. Life on the plantations was harsh and unforgiving. Enslaved men, women, and children worked long hours cutting cane under the tropical sun. Punishments were severe, families were separated, and yet resistance was constant. Some resisted quietly through cultural preservation, spiritual practices, and sabotage. Others chose open rebellion. In 1733, one of the earliest and most significant slave revolts in the Caribbean erupted on St. John. Enslaved Africans, many of them from the Akwamu people of present-day Ghana, organized a coordinated uprising. They seized control of much of the island, killing several plantation owners and taking over forts. For months they held power. It was a bold declaration. They would not accept chains without a fight. But Denmark, with assistance from French forces in Martinique, eventually crushed the rebellion. Many of the rebels chose suicide over capture. The revolt was suppressed, but the spirit of resistance never disappeared. It would echo across generations. By the late 1700s and early 1800s, global attitudes towards slavery began to shift. Denmark became the first European country to ban the transatlantic slave trade in 1803. However, slavery itself continued in the Danish West Indies for decades more. The plantation system remained intact. The suffering continued. Then came 1848. Rumors spread that emancipation was being delayed. Enslaved workers on St. Croix grew impatient. On July 3, 1848, thousands gathered in Frederiksted, led by a free black man named General Butto. They demanded immediate freedom. Faced with the threat of widespread violence, the Danish governor, Peter von Scholten, made a historic declaration. All unfree in the Danish West Indies are from today emancipated. Slavery was abolished in the islands, not by quiet reform, but by the pressure of rebellion. But freedom did not bring equality. Formerly enslaved people were forced into unfair labor contracts that kept them tied to plantations under harsh conditions. Economic power remained in the hands of a small elite. Tensions simmered once again, eventually boiling over in the Fireburn labor revolt of 1878 on St. Croix, when workers set plantations ablaze in protest of injustice. The Virgin Islands were beautiful, but beneath the beauty was struggle. Beneath the palm trees was resistance. And as the 19th century turned into the 20th, another global power began to watch these islands closely, the United States. By the early 1900s, the Danish West Indies were no longer the profitable sugar empire they once had been. Falling sugar prices, hurricane damage, and economic decline left Denmark struggling to maintain the islands. Meanwhile, across the Caribbean, the United States was expanding its influence. After the Spanish-American War in 1898, America had taken control of Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Philippines. The Caribbean was becoming an American strategic zone. The Virgin Islands sat in a critical location, guarding sea lanes that led to the newly constructed Panama Canal, which opened in 1914. American officials feared that if Germany or another European power gained control of the islands during World War I, it could threaten U.S. national security. The islands were no longer just tropical outposts, they were strategic military assets. Talks between Denmark and the United States had been happening for decades, but global tensions accelerated negotiations. In 1917, the United States officially purchased the Danish West Indies for $25 million in gold. On March 31, 1917, now known as Transfer Day, the Danish flag was lowered and the American flag was raised. The islands were renamed the United States Virgin Islands. For many residents, the transfer brought mixed emotions. Denmark had ended slavery decades earlier, but economic hardship remained. Some hoped American rule would bring prosperity, modernization, and political rights. Others feared yet another distant power making decisions without fully including the people who lived there. Initially, the islands were governed by the U.S. Navy. Military rule lasted from 1917 until 1931. Naval governors controlled laws, infrastructure, and daily life. Over time, however, local leaders pushed for more self-governance. Their demands reflected a long tradition of resistance that stretched back to the plantation revolts. In 1927, residents of the Virgin Islands were granted U.S. citizenship. It was a milestone, but not full equality. Islanders could not vote in U.S. presidential elections and still cannot today. The territory sends a delegate to Congress, but that delegate cannot vote on final legislation. The islands remain an unincorporated territory, belonging to, but not fully part of, the United States. During the 20th century, the economy gradually shifted from agriculture to tourism. The natural beauty that once masked plantation suffering became the foundation of a new industry. White sand beaches, coral reefs, and historic colonial architecture attracted travelers from around the world. After World War II, investment increased. Airports expanded, cruise ship docks grew larger, hotels lined the shores. Yet, even in this new era, echoes of the past remained visible. Plantation ruins still stand across St. Croix and St. John. Danish forts overlook harbors in St. Thomas. African cultural traditions live on in music, food, storytelling, and festivals like Carnival. The island's identity is a fusion, African, European, Caribbean, and American, all layered together through centuries of struggle and survival. The rebel spirit never disappeared. In the 1960s and 70s, civil rights movements influenced the islands, inspiring calls for greater autonomy and economic fairness. Local leaders worked to strengthen territorial governance. The revised Organic Act of 1954 established a greater degree of self-rule, allowing for an elected governor beginning in 1970. Today, the U.S. Virgin Islands stand as both paradise and reminder, a place of breathtaking beauty shaped by forced labor, revolution, colonial ambition, and resilience. Tourists may see beaches and sunsets, but history sees rebellion, courage, and transformation. The story of the Virgin Islands is not just about who controlled them, it is about who resisted. It is about a people who endured slavery, colonial rule, economic hardship, and political limitation, yet preserved culture, demanded rights, and shaped their own future. This is the legacy of the U.S. Virgin Islands, a paradise forged in struggle, and a land where the fight for dignity has always lived beneath the sand.